10-Minute University is a program of Clackamas County Master Gardener Association. It's offered in collaboration with and in support of the OSU Extension Service Master Gardener Program. At our website, you will find handouts, videos, upcoming classes, and workshops. Our program is volunteer-led, and we're supported by OSU faculty to ensure quality. Today, we will talk about fruit tree pruning. From my point of view, I think this is best done with hands-on practice. So I consider this as a partnership. I share ideas and you put them to practice. And therefore, along the talk, I'm going to be assigning homework. You heard the session is being recorded, therefore there is no need to take notes. However, it would be nice if you can write down the homework assignments and feel free to write them back to 10-Minute University if you have any questions. These are just a few of the university resources that I used in developing this presentation. Again, no need to write them down. You'll get the links along with the recording link. And I want to thank Bruce Nelson for offering comments on this talk today. Bruce is a master pruner who retired from Clackamas Community College Horticulture Department. As shown by the objectives on the screen, today we're going to cover some basic ideas before we talk about pruning common fruit trees. And those basic ideas are apical dominance, how to develop a strong framework, and how to train a young fruit tree. So let's begin with apical dominance. Apical dominance is the result of auxin, growth hormone that concentrate at the tip of a stem. Auxin speeds up the development of the top bud and inhibits shoots below from developing. Auxin moves by gravity. The effect of auxin is strongest in the vertical branch, moderate at an angle, and hardly there in a horizontal position. In fruit trees, we want the branch to produce fruit. Therefore, keep in mind the 45-degree angle, which is often what we seek. Keeping in mind how apical dominance works, let's look at two main pruning cuts. Heading cuts remove the tip or a portion of a branch, and thinning cuts, also called a removal cut, remove a branch by cutting at the point of its origin. So when we make a heading cut, we remove the terminal buds and all the hormone associated with it. And this allows the latent buds down below to develop. And as a result, we get a bushier plant. And thinning cut will open up the plant. When we remove thick, heavy branches, be sure to do it in 3 steps. First, make an undercut about 12 inches from the trunk where it's labeled A. Then second, go out 4 to 6 inches and remove the weight. It's labeled B. And finally, make the cut to remove the stub where it's labeled C. I just want to point out that if you haven't heard the latest research advice, we used to say make a cut at a 45-degree angle. That is no longer the case. The primary reason is because a 45-degree angle cut gives you a much bigger wound. Today, we advise making the cut that's perpendicular to the branch. So after you make a cut, take a look at the wound. It should be round and not oval. It's helpful to know where branch collar is. And unfortunately, collar appears different on different trees, and some trees it's really difficult to find. If you look at the photo on the left, the branch bark ridge is very easy to locate, and it is the result of the trunk wood pushing against the stem wood. Once you locate the branch bark ridge, move toward the stem. In this example, you see a swollen area, and that's where the collar is. We advise cutting beyond the collar along the yes line and not cut into the collar. And that's because collar is the area that is rich in energy reserve and chemicals to hinder the spread of decay. So keep the collar is always better in terms of sealing the wound and minimizing the damage to the tree. It's important for us to keep in mind, pruning creates wound, and wound always lead to rot. The smaller the wound, the smaller the internal damage in general. So as much as possible, we want to avoid making major cuts. And in pruning, these are a few things that we can do to minimize the damage. Number one, cut in the right place, meaning beyond the collar, preserve the collar in order to allow the tree to seal the wound and minimize the damage. Number two, cut at the right time. It's best to prune when the tree is not under stress, when it's too hot, too cold. When it's dormant, it's better. But for the disease-prone varieties, it's better to prune in the summer so you don't have an open wound there ready to be infected by pathogen. And cut the right amount. The advice I see a lot is do not remove more than a third of the foliage in 1 year. But more recently, I'm seeing more recommendations that's less, around a quarter of maximum foliage removal. So knowing that the smaller the cut, the less damage. If you are a procrastinator, I would say work very hard on pruning and try to do it timely. Because if you picture a bud in the wrong place when it's very young and can be just rubbed off with your finger, you're barely leaving a mark. And if you leave it there for years and have to saw off a limb, that's going to be painful and lead to decay for sure. We know fruit trees can live and produce for a long time, but in order to do that, they need a strong framework. So a strong framework can be judged by 3 factors: the branch placement, the branch angle, and the branch length. Well, let's look at each one of them. When we look at branch placement from the side, these branches should be spaced 8 to 24 inches apart. And looking down from the top, the branches should radiate from the trunk like spokes of a wheel. The vertical distance and the 360-degree coverage are ways to minimize competition and maximize exposure to sunlight. When it comes to branch angle, it's best to have 45 to 60 degree. If it's too wide, it will be less productive. And if it's too narrow, we have a weak joint, which can lead to branch failure down the road. If we let the trees grow on their own, they have the natural form they prefer. Apple and pear tend to develop a central leader, and cherry can grow into a vase shape by itself. But keep in mind, for the home orchard, all trees, all fruit and nut trees can be shaped into what's called open center. So when you look at the illustration down below, the central leader form is shaped sort of like a Christmas, and lights come from the side and the top, and that's where your active fruiting wood would be. open center is shaped like a vase. Light comes in through the center, reaching the rest of the canopy. And the tree tend to be wider and lower. In theory, the open center trees gives more productive space than a central leader. A modified central leader can be made by removing the top upward facing branches from a central leader. All right, so let's take a look at how do we train a young tree into a central leader form or an open center form. So we'll begin with the central leader form. And our nursery tree looks like this. Lots of branches, 3 on the top labeled ABC. Take a close look and you can see they have very narrow branch angle. They're all kind of stuck together. And if we want a central leader form, we only want 1 leader. So 2 should go. And then the branches down below, you can see they have very little vertical distance between them. So the simple way to fix is remove the 2 in between and keep those 2 labeled 1 and 2. So at planting, we will end up with a straight shoot going up, trying to be the leader, and 2 shoots down below, labeled 1 and 2. And if we want to encourage branching, we just simply remove the tip of these branches. And a year later, we're likely to get more branches, a fuller tree, and continue with that process. We'll end up with a tree with a pretty good structure. If we want to train into an open center form, I'm using an example that is a bare root whip. At planting, you make a heading cut at 24 to 36 inches above the graft union. Below this cut is where your scaffold going to come from. The main fruiting branches will come from. Any other shoots down below, take them off because they're too low to be useful. In response to that heading cutting the first summer, you're likely to have a tree looking like this with 3 to 4 branches. And you can tip them off lightly to encourage branching. And then the first winter, after a season of growth, you can come back and check for any branches that's facing down or growing toward the center of the plant or rubbing against each other and remove them. And that would leave you a tree with a good scaffold or main fruiting branches. If you're just starting a home orchard and plan to get a bare root whip, I want to encourage reading this book called Grow a Little Fruit Tree by Ann Ralph. What I like about this method is it does not rely on having a dwarf rootstock in order to get a little tree. Look at the size of this tree. It's absolutely amazing, and look at all the fruits on it. So her method is similar to what I've just explained. And let's just go through it quickly. So you begin with a bare root thin whip, and she emphasizes 5/8 inch caliper or smaller, so very, very young. Number 2, you do the sphere heading cut. Earlier, I said at 24 to 36 inch above the ground. She recommends 24 inch above the soil level. And then her other approach is do the pruning in the summer to control size. And so she primarily does the pruning and shaping of the new growth during the summer to develop the scaffold. And she does very heavy pruning to shorten shoots by 1/2 to 2/3. So if you have the stomach for making that initial cut, of 24-inch above soil level, it may be worth a try because this certainly gives you a small fruit tree that's much easier to manage in the home. Often we have enough branches, but they're not pointed the right direction. They may be pointed to upward, which means that the branch angle is too narrow. They may be pointed at a direction that we don't like. We want to redirect it. So that's where we need to use some training tools. If there is a branch going a direction that you don't like and you want to move it, you want to point it, let's say 20 degrees to the right, you simply drive a stake into the ground, tie a string to it, and connect it to the branch on the other side, and basically gently tugging the branch as it grows. If you have really narrow crotch angle, like in this photo here, you can widen the crotch angle with some training tools like the spreader. These are purchased from the store, but you can also make them out of wooden, small pieces of wood. You can also tie a string to the branch that you want to increase the branch angle and hang a weight at the other end, and that will pull the branch down and increase the angle. So there are a lot of different things you can do. And now I'm going to give you a homework assignment. I'd like you to take a look at the training video that's shown on the screen. Don't worry, you don't have to write it down. You will get the link after the webinar. This is, I think, about a 5-minute video, and it will bring to a 3-dimensional view of how we train a young fruit tree. Keep in mind, training should be done early because young branches are more pliable and they respond better to pruning. However, the young branches have thinner bark and they can be damaged easily. So we want to minimize the amount of time of training these branches. Come back and check periodically to see if the training result has been accomplished. And sometimes it may only take 1 month, but definitely no longer than 1 growing season. If you have a tree that has grown too tall, this is an illustration that seems pretty drastic. It's taken out of a handout from a publication from Oregon State University. And essentially, they advise that you simply remove the upward pointing branches as illustrated to reduce the height. And you may be concerned about having a big hole left from removing these branches, but it's obvious that where light hits, branches will develop. So soon you will have new shoots as candidates for possibly filling in the space and redevelop or reshape your scaffold for this fruit tree. If you do something like this, make sure you don't take too much in 1 year because this kind of a drastic reduction can damage the tree, especially if it's not very healthy or vigorous. And in addition, when you make big cuts like these, if you do it in the winter, you're going to get water sprouts, these vertical, vigorous looking shoots in the spring. And if you do it in the summer, after summer solstice, which is June 21st, you will get less vigorous response. So think about the timing in terms of what your objectives are and decide accordingly. OSU also has a publication on how to rejuvenate a mature fruit tree. And their example is what they call the old neglected apple tree. And I also provide another resource, which is it's called Pruning to Renovate Old Fruit Trees, so it's not limited to apple, from Penn State. Both of these provide very detailed step-by-step instructions, and I think they're worth a try. But keep these ideas in mind. Number one, when you are doing major surgery on an established tree, always think 3 to 5 years to complete the job. Number two, in general, you're reducing height and opening up the canopy with thinning cuts in order to let light in and stimulate new growth down below, further down in the tree in order to lower the height. But what we do in the height reduction and thinning of the canopy will put the tree on a diet. And if the tree is not very healthy to start out, this may be the beginning of a downhill decline in your tree. So there are definitely risks associated with them. And again, if you prune in the winter, you will stimulate new shoots in response to the pruning. And if you prune in the summer, you are going to reduce the vigor of the tree, but you're less likely to get new shoots develop as a result of your pruning cut. So in terms of timing and the result on the tree, if you see anything dead, disease, damaged, take it out as soon as you notice. That's simply good hygiene. Don't worry about the timing. In general, if you prune in the winter, it's best to do it when the plant is dormant. But you want to avoid freezing temperature because the trees are already under stress in severe weather, and pruning simply adds to the stress. And we do know pruning reduces the energy reserve in the tree because the branches we remove have the energy reserve in them, and taking them off, they're no longer available for growth. But they will, pruning cuts made in the winter will stimulate growth in the spring. And this is because the energy that is reserved in the tree, in the roots and in the stems, begin to flow out toward leaves in the spring. And when we make pruning cuts, we're reducing the potential areas to receive that energy. And as a result, we're going to get rampant growth in order for the energy to have an outlet. Now, if you prune in the summer pruning will reduce the capacity of photosynthesis because we're taking off a number of leaves. And that can reduce the vigor of the tree, kind of put it on the diet. And if you do too much removal of the foliage, it can lead to sun skull. So to answer the question of when is a good time to prune, there are pros and cons for any season. And it really depends on where you live, what kind of tree you have, and what your objectives are. We do know trees that are prone to disease, like cherry, plum, apricot, peach, in the Pacific Northwest should be pruned in the summer, and this is done immediately after harvest. Now, this doesn't mean pruning in the winter is always safe. So for the tree you have, and given the area you live, you should find out what are the common diseases that can attack your tree and what their life cycle is. Because some pathogens fungal pathogens do send out spores in the winter and or spring or fall. They each have their seasonality. So it would be worth a little bit of time to figure that out. And this is the kind of question that you can send to your master gardener extension office, and they can do the research for you. So we know there can be many different pruning goals. the important thing is to be clear about what is your reason for pruning. So no pruning just for pruning's sake. Figure out why you're pruning before making any cuts. And this is a page from a University of California publication. Again, you will get the link to it. It, in one page, summarizes the location of fruiting buds, which I find very helpful. Because after all, a pruning fruit tree is all about managing fruiting wood. So let's look at this together. The location of fruiting wood, it can be on long shoots. Well, it can be on shoots, long or short, or on spurs. And they can be positioned or distributed laterally or terminally. Well, we are going to look at some examples of shoots. And lateral basically means along, and terminal means at the tip. So if fruits are laterally distributed on the long shoot, it simply means along this entire long shoot, you're likely to find fruit distributed. But if it's terminal, it will be at the tip of the long shoot. Now let's take a look at shoots and spurs. The photo on the left shows a branch that have long shoots and short shoot and some spurs. And the two photos on the right show you examples of spurs. So it's pretty obvious shoots are skinnier and longer, and spurs are much shorter and stockier. Now that we know shoots and spurs, let's figure out how do we tell their age, which is also important. So if you look at the picture in the lower right, you'll see to the left, a richer color portion that's 1 year old or new wood. And to the right of this arrow, it's 2-year-old wood. And they're separated by something called a bud scale scar. When you look at a tree and locate the bud scale scar, they will look like these thin rings kind of stacked together. And we know new wood tends to be richer in color and old wood is duller. So let's take a look at the photo on the left. Our 1-year-old wood, colorful. At the tip, we have a bud scale scar right here. And then we have 2-year-old wood, less colorful, kind of more gray, more bud scale scar here, down to 3-year-old, more bud scale scar here, to 4-year-old, etc. So here is a homework assignment. On your fruit tree, look for the shoot, the spur, look for the bud scale scar, get acquainted with the fruiting parts and the foliage part on your tree and their age. Now, if your tree is a peach, nectarine, persimmon, or fig, no, they don't have spur, they only have shoots. Now we're getting ready to prune some trees. Last year, I went to the home orchard of Mike and Jane Collier, and they graciously allowed me to prune with them. And I took lots of photos for this class. So let's begin with apples and pears. Apples and pears fruit mostly on spurs and tips of short shoot. So the photos down below show the pear spur and apple spur. So these are very valuable. And the 2 to 3-year-old wood will become productive. So we can get apple production. We can get flowers in maybe 2 years and fruiting probably in 3 to 4 years. And the spurs live for a long time. And that's another reason for taking excellent care of spurs on these trees. Here is an apple tree, the before. and after. We have a short pruning video on pruning an apple tree, and you might want to look at it to get a different perspective. But in this class, I'm going to walk you through with photo images. So we'll begin with the top portion because that's where there's the most vigorous growth and we need the most intervention. And I'm going to talk about shoots, the framework, spurs, and fruit. Beginning with shoots, including water sprouts, which are very vigorous and pointed upright, they present a challenge. In this tree, we have a lot of water sprouts, and they probably resulted from hard pruning the previous year, so during the winter. So here are some options. You can take out all of them, but you're basically inviting more water sprouts to grow in response. You can cut some and keep some. And those you keep, you can put their apical dominance to work, which means that the hormone in those branches are likely to help keep the adjoining area from developing new shoots. You can also keep some that can be trained, weigh it down at an angle, and it will become new fruiting wood. So there are some options, but we took out most of them in this one because height is an issue. The non-water sprout shoots can be treated this way. And I'm taking information from Orrin Martin, who was for, I think, decades, manager of fruit orchards in the University of California system. And I like the way he described how we should consider shoots and options in pruning them. So consider this as a guide, not something that is set as exactly what you should do. So Martin says that in general, remove 20% of the new shoots. And he advised spacing the shoots 7 to 9 inches apart. So this means that if you have something that looks too close together, you remove one in order to, I think, reduce shading. He also said, look at the angle of how these shoots have grown. If they're really vertical, obviously they're not productive. And so you can remove them. You can train them by lowering, by changing their angle and help them to become more productive. And the point that he made, which is a little maybe counterintuitive, is he says to keep all the weak looking shoots. Now, maybe when you see something that's weak and did not grow a whole lot, you think, oh, that's not good, I should not keep it. But the weak ones, and by that he means that it grew 8 to 10 or less than 8 inches last season. So it's kind of a short shoot, not particularly vigorous looking, and it's most likely at an angle, let's say 45-degree angle. Leave it alone because they will likely fruit on their own with no pruning, no intervention. And if you see shoots that are really vigorous, which means that they have grown a lot in one season, last season, you want to prune them back to a few buds because you don't want the fruiting wood to progressively get too far out from the center. And if you don't want to have a vigorous response to the cutting of these shoots, you can simply wait until the summer to come back and do the pruning. Okay. After we dealt with the shoots, we look at the framework, walk around. Does it have good coverage? Are there branches overlapping or crossing? Is there any fruiting branches that's too low? And we check for suckers kind of near the rootstock to see if anything had come up, and all of those need to be addressed. Then we look at spurs. Spurs in apples can live 8 to 10 years, produce for a long time. So we want to take extra good care of them. And by that, I mean, make sure they get plenty of sunlight. So here's an example of a very strong looking spur. And in contrast, a weak one. The weak one is most likely grown in too much shade. If you really want to keep it, you can head it back a little bit and see if you could not rejuvenate it. And on the strong looking example, you can see a fat bud, which is likely a fruit bud, and you can see skinny or flatter buds, which are most likely leaf buds. And finally, we need to address fruit. Sure, we grow fruit trees in order to harvest fruit, but it's important to manage the fruit load, because if we don't, we end up with perhaps more fruit, but of poorer quality. And in the worst case scenario, the heavy fruit load can break the branches, wreck up our framework of the fruit tree, and create major problems. There are two ways to thin the fruit. One is by thinning the fruiting branches, and this example shows how to do that. I prefer this method over thinning fruits. I find it emotionally just challenging to actually take fruit off the tree. So in apples and pears, they should be thinned 6 to 8 inches apart. Another way to do it is they come in clusters. So every cluster thinned it to one fruit. And the best time to do the fruit thinning is what's called June drop. So usually in June, Mother Nature will help with shedding fruits off trees. And so it's easier to do it after June drop, but usually that does not do enough. And keep in mind, the fruit size for thinning should be between a dime and a quarter. Don't wait until it's become an almost fully formed fruit, then thin it. That does not do any good. All right, so we've walked through the steps of pruning an apple tree, and now we're going to look at photographs showing the same approach with the Asian pear, before and after. Shoots, including water sprouts, take some out. The vertical ones, remove a lot, maybe weigh them down to encourage them to become productive. Ones at an angle and not too long are the best to leave alone. And you can always head back the ones that are too vigorous, but at an angle to 2 or 3 buds. One thing to keep in mind is Cornell University did some study years back, and they found on average, apple and pear trees need 30 some leaves. I think it's 32 or 35 leaves to support a fruit. So we need to leave enough leaves in order to have a good fruit crop. But if we have too much leaf, we're going to end up with problems of shade, so the fruit will not develop properly. Okay, so our Asian pear, look at the framework, see if anything needs to be adjusted. We found a fruiting branch that has grown too far from the center and potentially at risk of breaking. Sure, you can brace it with a post every year, but we chose to shorten it. And we looked at the spurred. Spurs in in pairs live 6 to 8 years. So we check for their location to make sure they get enough sunlight, and it may take some thinning of shoots overhead. And then fruit thinning, 2 ways to do it: thinning fruit branch or thinning fruits. Okay, so if you choose to do a homework assignment, and if you have an apple tree, so what I have read is if you thin the fruit to a single fruit per cluster, you have less disease risk because there is not a whole lot of places for pest and disease to grow. You might make a note and check the summer to see if that's true with your tree. So here's a quiz. What will you do? 2 branches that grew last year, very vigorous, parallel, and we're pruning this tree. How do we think about whether we should, what should we do with them? Okay, so this is what I would do. I would walk around the tree and see if there is a gap in the canopy that can be filled with one of these. And I would keep one if there is space that, if there is space for this branch to develop. And I would probably not keep both because they're pretty close together. And over time, if both develop, there will be too much competition and neither will do well. I don't think it matters too much which one I would keep, but the one I keep, I definitely will shorten to probably 3 buds or so. All right, so we will move on away from the palm fruits and into the stone fruit. So cherries. Cherries fruit on spurs and along short shoots. And both sweet and sour cherries fruit best on 1-year-old wood and pretty young spurs. So even though the spurs can live for a long time, it's the younger ones that are most productive. So these are the pruning tips for areas that have wet winter. We advise pruning the summer to minimize disease problem. And cherry trees do not like major cuts. I saw a number of people sending questions before the webinar about cherry tree being too tall and if, you know, how to bring down the height. Well, just know if you make major cuts, that's 2-inch diameter or larger, there's a good risk of rot as a result. But in general, we're removing 20% of the new shoots, and we're really basically balancing the production for next year and light penetration for the current season fruiting, because our fruit will come from the 1-year-old wood, which is shoots developed last year, but we need to provide enough light to encourage new shoots to grow this year, and that's how and where we get next year's fruit. So this is the before and after of our cherry tree. And we open up the center, we shorten and remove some of the long shoots, and we removed crossing and downward facing branches. We did have to make a reduction cut in this cherry, and that's noted on the photo on the left. And the illustration on the right shows how to make a reduction cut. Where the 2 branches come together, we make a cut to take out the upright, more vigorous branch. And a reduction cut, usually it's done to take away the vigor, to slow the growth of the remaining branch. And this is not a cut to be taken lightly, because when I was talking about preserving color in making a cut in order to reduce the chance of rot. Reduction cut is cutting to an area where there is no collar at all. So this is something that carries a greater risk. Moving on to plum and apricots, they fruit mostly on spurs and along short shoots. And the spurs live different amount of years, and there are differences between the European plum and Asian. In general, the Asians grow much more vigorously, and the European is much less vigorous. So the general pruning tip would be you prune in the summer to reduce disease problems. You shorten 20% of the shoots to 1 to 3 buds. And this will allow you to stimulate new growth, which will give you fruit in coming years, while still preserving the fruiting potential for the current year. And fruit thinning is very important. And the recommendation for European plum and apricot is 3 to 5 inches apart, and Asian plum and pluots are 5 to 6 inches apart. This is our Italian plum that we pruned. And the major things we did are removing some crossing and overlapping branches. We did shorten some of the shoots to 2-3 buds to stimulate new growth. And one thing I want to mention is, in general, when we're looking at fruit trees, we look from the outside toward the center to judge whether branches are overlapping, whether they have good sun exposure. And periodically, you want to crawl under the canopy and look up, because when you look up, you'll find it's a different perspective, and I think a more accurate way to see where there is more congestion. And another thing is plum and apricot need what's called re-scaffold every 8 to 10 years. And this happens if the fruiting wood becomes so high and out of reach. And the re-scaffolding is a pretty scary process. Basically, for example, if you have a 10-foot branch, you cut off 8 feet. And in order to stimulate new growth and develop that into a new scaffold. Moving on to peaches and nectarines. Peaches and nectarines fruit mostly along long shoots. This is the first long shoots as the location of fruit that we have seen. And they fruit on 1-year-old wood. So 1-year-old wood is what developed last year. And so try to picture, this is a branch developed last year with the fruit along this branch. And we all have an idea of roughly how big these peaches can get and how heavy they can get. So it's really important. I'm sorry. Sorry about the interruption. In peaches and nectarines, it's really important to shorten the shoots where fruits can be and thin fruit in order to avoid breaking these branches. The best peach grows on young shoots hung from fairly young fruiting branch, 3 to 5 year old. So they need to be re-scaffolded periodically. Again, cut a branch low to the ground and stimulate new growth to form a new fruiting branch. Oh, forgot to mention, there is an NC State, North Carolina State video on pruning a mature peach tree. You'll get the link, and I really like it. I hope you take time to look at it. Okay, we're going to wrap up with persimmon and fig. persimmons fruit on current season growth, greenwood, grown from 1-year-old shoots. Once you establish a persimmons framework, try not to make any heading cuts on it because it will respond in a way that will be very challenging. So here's a photo showing 1-year-old wood, which is very rich and dark. And imagine if this is not shortened and all of the buds will develop into new shoots, and along the new shoots come fruit, the weight will be awesome. So be sure to do enough shortening of the branches in order to manage the fruit load. And our final fruit is figs. Figs in the Pacific Northwest generate possibly 2 crops. The first crop will come along the first year wood, and usually we get them in early summer, maybe June, July. And the second crop will come in late summer, early fall, depending on how long the summer is and how hot it gets. So the first crop for us is more certain, and the second is questionable. And one way to think about pruning fig is anything that's 2 years or older is not productive. It only works as scaffold to support the fruiting wood. And what you could do is in the winter, cut back 50% of the shoots from last year and just cut it down to 2 buds. So this is a heading cut. And what you're doing is the heading cuts will stimulate new growth. And that's where you'll potentially get the second crop in late summer and fall. And the branches you leave alone will give you the first crop in early summer. Also on the screen is a pruning a fig tree video that we did. And if you grow filbert, remove 25% or less. They don't need a whole lot of pruning. Focus on crossing branches, low-hanging branches, water sprouts to keep the form good. So this is the University of California summary table. Again, you will get the link to it. And some resources, you'll get all of these links. And all the videos, not all, some of the videos from Tammany University. So I would suggest this action plan. Number 1, get to know the collar, shoots, and spurs on your fruit tree and be able to tell their age. Number 2, assess your tree for the framework, look for ways to improve them. Number 3, if you have a young tree, start training for a good framework. And if you have a mature fruit tree, make a plan for pruning. Take some photos, look at them on a computer, and figure out an action plan. And it's helpful to think about what is your production target, because not every tree needs to produce as many fruit as possible. There are so many fruits that we can use. I mean, there is a limit to what we can use. And think about the quality versus quantity. Think about the job of thinning fruits necessary to get good quality fruit and reduce the disease and pest pressure. And factor that into your pruning plan. And enjoy and have fun. And this is one way I have fun with my persimmon harvest. So we're done. And we don't have a whole lot of time for questions. And some of the questions for fruit tree pruning may be complicated. So I invite you to send your question and make sure you include photos and clearly describe what is the problem and what your goals are to the 10-Minute U Gmail account. And I'll be happy to answer them. And now let's do some Q&A.
Hi, Sherry. Great presentation. Okay, Patty was wonderful and answered a lot of the questions to the people, back to them, but I do have a few more. This person has a young tree and it was already pruned to a central leader. Should they leave it or should they change it to an open center, an apple tree?
Well, apple trees do like being a central leader naturally. So if height is not a big issue for them, it depends on the rootstock they have. If they have semi-dwarf, really dwarf rootstock, the tree may not get naturally that big, so the height may not be an issue. But if they do want to keep the tree shorter, they can remove the upward pointed portion and convert it to a modified central leader. And that will encourage the tree to grow out a little bit and be less tall. So that's an option. Yeah.
Okay, great. What about trimming a tree that was planted 5 years ago, but it was never pruned, never trimmed at all? A fruit tree.
I think it would be, it's hard to tell without looking at a photo. Probably just look at the tree structure and compare it against kind of ideally what we're looking for, the vertical distance in the branch placement, the 360-degree coverage around the tree trunk, and see if there are some major issues that really need to be addressed. The tree may be in perfect shape and need no training, no pruning. So yeah.
Okay, there were several people that were very confused about the 3 cuts you do on a large branch, and they were wondering why you do that undercut.
Okay, so I have seen my husband do this many times without the undercut. So he will look at a big branch on a tree and he goes out and cut it with a chainsaw, and he will just try to make one cut, and the cut will be done halfway, and he wants to take a break, and the weight of the branch begin to come down on the ground, and the bark begin to peel underneath and end up damaging the trunk, which creates a horrible wound. So the undercut is to prevent that kind of peeling and damage to the main trunk.
Okay. We also had several people that asked about putting on wound dressing.
Sealant is out. There had been research to show they don't really work. I was just looking at example of the sealant area of this tree that has been diligently painted and repainted every year over the cut to protect the cut. And then they open up the seal and look underneath, and they see all these dead wood with fungus mushrooms on them. And so, no, it does not help. And in fact, some research showed that it hurts because it's sealing in the bad stuff, the pathogen. So no sealant, save your money.
Okay. I remember when you were talking about using vertical cuts instead of an angle cut. This person said, for pruning vertical branches, do we still follow the perpendicular cut, or is it important to have an angle that avoids the water from pooling on top of the branch?
Yes, the recommendation is make the cut perpendicular to the branch. Create the smallest wound possible. That's it.
Okay, so we're not worried about the water pooling, or we're just worrying about how much branch is being cut, how large the cut is.
Yeah, I think the research is showing that the size of the wound is a bigger factor to deal with, to be concerned about, than anything else.
Okay. All right. If you've still got a couple more minutes, this person has a 3-year-old tree that's loaded with a lot of little spindly branches. They're attached to really strong, healthy branches. So can all those little spindly branches be trimmed off?
What kind of tree is this?
I think they said it was an apple tree.
So
no, I'm sorry. Forgive me. It was a plum tree.
Oh, okay. The the fruiting wood is younger and tend to be skinnier, right?
Yes,
yeah, compared to apples. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, in the plum, you're developing a scaffold structure. So you have your trunk, And then you have the main fruiting branches, they're called scaffold. And that could be 3, 4, 5, whatever is the number. And then from there, you have secondary growth, and your fruit will be on that secondary or even the next layer of growth. So I would not worry too much about them. If they think there are a lot of really tiny spindly branches, I would cut them back to 2, 3 buds and stimulate some new growth, and see if that would not invigorate them. And the fringe benefit is you get fruits in 2 seasons. Yeah.
Okay. You already talked about this a little bit, but the central leader tree is too tall and they want to prune it hard to lower the top. You already kind of explained about that, but if you want to just kind of explain that again.
Yeah. If you want to lower the height of a tree, the OSU publication and also the Penn State publication are good references because they have illustration and photos to show step by step what the tree looked like. But essentially, you look at the top area of your tree where you want to reduce the height. And you look for opportunities to make thinning cuts. So you're removing the branch all the way to the point of its origin. And you want to do thinning cuts only or as much as possible. So what happens after you make those cuts? You're reducing the height of the tree. You are opening up light penetration into lower parts of the tree. And that light is going to encourage new growth of branches, leaves, etc. And the new growth will become the future potential or candidates for your fruiting wood. So basically what you're doing in lowering a tree, and I want to emphasize, think a 4 or 5 year process. You know, it's not done in 1 year. So think removing some and then let light come in, see how the tree respond, and then make further decisions. But essentially, as much as possible, you use thinning cuts, take out portions, open up the canopy, and the portions you take out reduce the height, and you're gradually lowering the tree, stimulating new growth, and that new growth is where you're going to get better quality fruit in the form of spurs and shoots.
Okay. And for the last question, they have several-year-old figs and persimmons and a couple of other types of, and they want to know if it's possible to nick a mature branch and apply a hormone, and will that help to create a new bud? Do you know?
Apply a hormone to create. Yeah, it is a practice in fruit trees that you can nick a part of the branch. Basically, where you're doing this with the nicking, you know, the really thin scoring of the branch, is you are stopping oxen from reaching it. So that's one established practice encouraging development of a side shoot or a new branch. But I don't know about the part including hormone, etc. I do know another option is if you want to make a new plant, for example, you simply take a branch and you can layer it. You can stick it in the ground, or you can wrap some moist organic material around it and score it, use a rooting hormone, and then you can get a new plant because roots will grow into that.
Right, right. Okay, that's about it.
All right.